A black man named Snoop Dogg is wrongfully arrested by two racist police officers, Riley and Jenkins. But when Snoop's true identity is revealed, the entire police station is left speechless. What happened, and who really is Snoop Dogg, that made the whole police station realize they were facing not just a legal case, but a monumental reckoning? Let's find out. It was a typical morning in the heart of the city. The sun was just beginning to peek over the tall buildings, casting long shadows on the bustling streets below. The sound of car horns, distant sirens, and chatter filled the air. People were starting their day, rushing to work, grabbing coffee, or walking their dogs. The neighborhood was alive, vibrant, and full of energy. Among the crowd, Snoop Dogg walked calmly, a stark contrast to the hurried pace around him. Snoop, now in his early 50s, was dressed in a casual but sharp outfit, baggy jeans, a Compton sweatshirt, and a sleek pair of his signature sneakers. His presence commanded attention, not because he sought it, but because of the quiet charisma he naturally exuded. He had just finished breakfast at a local diner he frequented when in the city, a place where the staff always greeted him warmly. As he approached his car, a custom-designed Cadillac parked on the street, Snoop felt the familiar buzz of his phone in his pocket. Pulling it out, he smiled as he read a message from his wife reminding him about their plans for later that evening. He quickly replied, letting her know he hadn't forgotten and that he was looking forward to it. Just as he was about to unlock his car, Snoop noticed two police officers walking toward him. Their eyes were locked on him, their expressions hard and unreadable. Snoop didn't recognize them, but that wasn't surprising. He was used to being approached by law enforcement for both good and bad reasons. What stood out this time was the intensity of their gaze. "Excuse me, sir," one of the officers called out as they approached. Snoop stopped, tucking his phone back into his pocket and turning to face them. His expression was calm, his demeanor unshaken. "Yes, officer?" Snoop replied, his voice steady but polite. He noticed the name on the officer's badge, Riley. The other officer, Jenkins, stood slightly behind, his hand resting near his holster. "Can I see some ID?" Riley asked sharply, his tone leaving little room for friendliness. "May I ask why?" Snoop responded, maintaining eye contact. He had been taught early in life how to handle these situations, to stay calm, be respectful, and avoid escalating the situation. Riley smirked. "You match the description of someone we're looking for. It's a simple request." Snoop raised an eyebrow but complied. "All right," he said, reaching into his back pocket for his wallet. He handed over his driver's license and waited. Riley examined the ID, his eyes narrowing slightly. "What are you doing in this neighborhood?" Riley asked, his tone accusatory. Snoop blinked, momentarily taken aback by the question. "I was just having breakfast," he replied truthfully. "Is there a problem?" "We've had reports of suspicious activity," Riley said dismissively. "Where are you headed now?" "To my car," Snoop replied evenly. "I have some studio work later." Riley handed back the ID with a smirk that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Studio work, huh? And what kind of work is that?" "I'm a musician," Snoop said, his calm demeanor unwavering. "A musician," Riley repeated, glancing at Jenkins, who gave a small snort. "You don't say." Jenkins finally spoke up. "You got anything illegal in that car of yours?" he asked, his hand still resting near his weapon. Snoop's heart rate quickened, but he kept his composure. "No, officer. You're welcome to check, but I'd prefer you didn't waste your time." "You don't get to decide how we do our job," Riley snapped. "Step away from the car." Snoop hesitated. He knew this could escalate quickly, but before he could take another step, Riley grabbed his arm and twisted it behind his back. The move was sudden, catching Snoop off guard. "Hey, what are you doing?" Snoop protested, wincing at the pain shooting through his shoulder. "You're under arrest for resisting arrest," Riley said coldly as Jenkins moved in to cuff Snoop's other hand. "Resisting arrest?" Snoop exclaimed, disbelief lacing his voice. "I haven't resisted anything." Nearby, a crowd began to gather. Among them was Mrs. Agnes Carter, an elderly woman who lived in the neighborhood. She had seen Snoop many times and knew he wasn't a troublemaker. "What are you doing to him?" she called out, her voice trembling with anger. "He didn't do anything wrong." A young couple walking their dog stopped to watch. The man pulled out his phone and began recording. "This is messed up," he muttered. Snoop caught sight of the phone and felt a flicker of hope. Maybe the footage would help later. But for now, he was powerless. The officers shoved him into the back of the squad car and slammed the door. As the car began to pull away, Snoop turned his head to look out the window at the growing crowd. He took a deep breath and said, loud enough for them to hear, "This isn't over." The police station was a stark contrast to the bustling streets outside. Cold gray walls, harsh fluorescent lights, and the constant hum of activity set the scene. Officers moved briskly through the corridors, some chatting, others focused on their tasks. The station was busy, but there was an underlying tension in the air that made people speak in hushed tones and glance over their shoulders. Snoop Dogg was led through the station's front doors, his hands cuffed behind his back. Officers Riley and Jenkins flanked him, their expressions unreadable. As they passed through the booking area, a few officers glanced up, their eyes narrowing slightly as they took in Snoop's appearance. He was clearly not the usual suspect they brought in. A well-dressed black man, calm and composed, with an aura of confidence that seemed out of place here. "Over here," Riley barked, steering Snoop toward a desk where a tired-looking officer sat behind a computer. The officer glanced up, then down at the screen, barely acknowledging Snoop's presence. "Name?" the officer asked, fingers poised over the keyboard. "Snoop Dogg," Riley replied before Snoop could speak. The officer typed the name into the system, his eyes scanning the screen. He frowned slightly but didn't say anything, motioning for Riley to bring Snoop over to the fingerprinting station. "Let's get this over with," Riley muttered, pushing Snoop forward. Snoop didn't resist. He knew better than to give them any reason to escalate things further. As they took his fingerprints, he remained silent, his mind racing. He couldn't believe this was happening. He had done nothing wrong, yet here he was, being treated like a criminal. Still, he knew he had to stay calm. This wasn't the first time he'd faced this kind of situation, and it likely wouldn't be the last. Once the fingerprinting was done, Riley and Jenkins led Snoop to a small holding cell at the back of the station. The cell was cramped, with a narrow bench along one wall and a metal toilet in the corner. The air was thick with the smell of disinfectant and something sour and unpleasant. They uncuffed him and shoved him inside. "Make yourself comfortable," Jenkins sneered, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "You might be here for a while." Snoop sat down on the bench, taking a deep breath. He didn't respond to their taunts. There was no point. He knew they were trying to provoke him, trying to get a reaction, but he wasn't going to give them that satisfaction. As Riley and Jenkins walked away, they exchanged a glance, a silent understanding passing between them. They had done their job, brought in another suspect, and now they could move on to whatever came next. But something about this arrest gnawed at Riley, something that made him uneasy. He couldn't quite put his finger on it, but the way Snoop had handled himself, the calmness, the confidence, it didn't fit the profile of someone they usually picked up. "Think he's really famous, huh?" Jenkins scoffed as they walked back to the front desk. "Probably just another punk with a flashy car." "Yeah," Riley muttered, though his mind was elsewhere. Something about Snoop was different, but he couldn't figure out what it was. Shaking his head, he tried to push the thought away. It didn't matter. They had followed protocol, or so he told himself. Back in the holding cell, Snoop sat quietly, his thoughts focused. He knew this wasn't just about him. This was about something bigger, a pattern he had seen play out time and time again. He had been targeted, of that he was certain, but he didn't know why. As he waited, he kept his composure, refusing to let fear or anger take over. He had been through worse, and he knew he would get through this too. An hour passed before anything happened. The door to the holding area swung open, and a woman stepped inside. She was in her late 30s, with sharp eyes and an air of authority that made everyone take notice. Her name was Lieutenant Kate Thompson, and she was new to the station, having been transferred from another precinct just a few weeks earlier. She was still getting to know the team, but she had already made it clear that she was not someone to be underestimated. Thompson's gaze swept over the room, taking in the officers going about their business. She spotted Riley and Jenkins at the front desk, talking quietly among themselves. Something about their demeanor caught her attention. She had learned to trust her instincts, and right now, they were telling her that something was off. Riley. "Jenkins!" she called out, walking over to them. "What's going on here?" Riley looked up, surprised to see her. "Nothing much, ma'am. Just another day." Thompson's eyes narrowed. "Really? Because I heard you brought someone in this morning. A man named Snoop Dogg." Riley stiffened slightly, but he quickly recovered. "Yes, ma'am, we did." "And what was the charge?" she asked, her tone calm but probing. "Resisting arrest," Riley replied, his voice steady. "We had reason to believe he was involved in suspicious activity. When we questioned him, he refused to cooperate." Thompson raised an eyebrow. "Did he now?" Riley nodded. "Yes, ma'am." Thompson didn't respond immediately. Instead, she studied Riley's face, searching for any sign that he was lying. She had dealt with officers like him before, men who thought they could bend the rules as long as it suited them. But she was different. She had come up through the ranks by doing things by the book, and she expected her team to do the same. "Take me to him," she said finally, her voice leaving no room for argument. Riley hesitated for a fraction of a second before nodding. "Right this way, ma'am." As they walked toward the holding cells, Thompson couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this than Riley was letting on. When they reached Snoop's cell, Thompson stopped, her gaze locking onto the man inside. He was sitting on the bench, his hands folded in his lap, his posture relaxed despite the circumstances. There was something about him, something that made her pause. "This is him?" she asked, turning to Riley. "Yes, ma'am," Riley confirmed. "Like I said, he resisted arrest, so we had no choice but to bring him in." Thompson didn't respond right away. Instead, she opened the cell door and stepped inside. Snoop looked up, meeting her gaze with calm, steady eyes. He didn't seem intimidated, but he also didn't appear defiant. His composure was unshaken. "Mr. Dogg," Thompson said, her voice measured. "I'm Lieutenant Kate Thompson. I'm here to ask you a few questions." "Of course, Lieutenant," Snoop replied politely. "I'm happy to cooperate." Thompson nodded, appreciating his calm demeanor. "I've been told that you resisted arrest, which led to your being brought in. I'd like to hear your side of the story." Snoop kept his gaze steady. "Lieutenant, I did no such thing. I complied with every instruction given to me by Officers Riley and Jenkins. I was walking to my car when they stopped me. I asked them why I was being detained, and that simple question seemed to escalate the situation. Before I knew it, I was handcuffed and accused of resisting arrest, despite following their orders." Thompson listened carefully, her eyes narrowing slightly as she processed Snoop's words. There was something about his tone, calm, measured, but with an underlying firmness, that suggested he wasn't just another man trying to talk his way out of trouble. She turned to Riley, who was standing a few feet behind her, his expression carefully neutral. "Is that true, Riley?" Thompson asked, her voice sharp. "Did Mr. Dogg comply with your instructions?" Riley shifted uncomfortably. "Well, ma'am, he questioned us, and things got tense. We had reason to believe he might be hiding something." Thompson's gaze hardened. "And what exactly was that reason?" Riley hesitated, unable to come up with a convincing response. "It was just a gut feeling, ma'am." "A gut feeling?" Thompson repeated, incredulous. "Is that the basis for your arrest now?" Riley opened his mouth to respond, but was cut off by the sound of the holding area door opening again. All eyes turned as Officer Stevens entered, looking slightly out of breath. He paused when he saw the group in the cell, realizing he had walked into a tense situation. "Lieutenant, I need to speak with you," Stevens said quickly, glancing between Snoop and Riley. Thompson gave Riley a final hard look before stepping out of the cell and closing the door behind her. "What is it, Stevens?" Stevens lowered his voice, clearly trying to keep the conversation private. "Ma'am, I've been doing some digging. Snoop Dogg isn't just anyone. He's a globally recognized artist and entrepreneur. But more importantly, He's been involved in major community initiatives. He's a prominent voice in social justice, and his arrest without cause is going to blow up in our faces." Thompson felt her stomach drop. She had suspected there was more to this, but hearing the full scope of who Snoop was made the situation even more serious. "Are you sure?" "Positive," Stevens replied, handing her his phone with a web page pulled up. It showed Snoop's recent projects, community outreach programs, donations to underfunded schools, and even advocacy for criminal justice reform. "This is him? If we don't handle this carefully, it's going to be a disaster." Thompson quickly scanned the page, her eyes widening as she read about Snoop's background. He wasn't just a celebrity. He was a force for good in the community, someone with influence and reach that could turn this situation into a national scandal. She turned to look at Riley, who was still standing by the cell with Jenkins, both of them looking increasingly uneasy. Thompson knew she had to act fast. The situation was spiraling out of control, and she couldn't afford to let it get any worse. "Riley, Jenkins," Thompson called out, walking back toward them with a sense of urgency. "We need to talk, now." The two officers exchanged a glance before following Thompson out of the holding area. Once they were in a more private part of the station, Thompson rounded on them, her expression fierce. "Do you have any idea who you've just arrested?" she demanded, keeping her voice low but intense. "Snoop Dogg isn't just some guy off the street. He's a global figure and a community leader. If this gets out, and it will, it's going to be a public relations nightmare." Riley paled slightly, his bravado faltering. "Ma'am, we didn't know. He didn't say anything about being famous." "It doesn't matter," Thompson snapped. "You should have done your due diligence before bringing him in. Now we have to figure out how to handle this, and fast." As she spoke, the sound of raised voices from outside the station began to filter in. Thompson's head snapped up, her heart sinking as she realized what was happening. The crowd outside was growing larger, and they were getting louder. She could hear the unmistakable chants of protesters demanding justice and Snoop's release. "Great," Thompson muttered under her breath. "Just what we needed." Stevens, who had been hovering nearby, stepped forward. "Lieutenant, the community is already fired up about this. We've got activists, local leaders, and even some media starting to show up. If we don't do something soon, this could turn into a full-blown crisis." Thompson knew he was right. She had seen situations like this before, small incidents that escalated into something much bigger because they weren't handled properly. But this was different. This wasn't just about diffusing a tense situation. It was about protecting the integrity of the police force and avoiding a legal and public relations nightmare. "We need to get ahead of this," Thompson said decisively. "Riley, Jenkins, I want you to prepare a full report on the arrest, detailing every step you took and why. I don't care how late we're here. Get it done. Stevens, help me figure out the best way to handle the press. We need to control the narrative before it gets out of hand." As the officers scattered to carry out her orders, Thompson felt the weight of the situation pressing down on her. She had only been at the station for a few weeks, and already she was dealing with a potential disaster. But she wasn't about to let this ruin her career or the reputation of her department. Inside the holding cell, Snoop remained seated, his mind racing as he listened to the commotion outside. He could hear the crowd growing louder, their voices echoing through the station. He knew his family, friends, and fans would be among them, along with community leaders and activists who had always stood by him. They wouldn't let this go unanswered. Back in the front of the station, the tension continued to build. Outside, the crowd had swelled to over 100 people, armed with signs and banners demanding justice for Snoop. Reporters had arrived, their cameras trained on the scene, capturing every moment. The police station was becoming a flashpoint, a symbol of the growing unrest in the community. Lieutenant Thompson watched the scene unfold from the station's front window, her jaw clenched in frustration. She knew she had to do something, but she was walking a tightrope. One wrong move, and everything could explode. But if she did nothing, the situation would spiral out of control on its own. She turned to Stevens, who was standing beside her, looking equally concerned. "We need to release him," she said finally, her voice tight. "It's the only way to de-escalate this." Stevens nodded in agreement. But how are we going to explain it to the media? They're not going to just accept that we let him go without an explanation. Thompson thought for a moment before answering. We frame it as a misunderstanding. Say that after reviewing the evidence, we determined there was no basis for the arrest and decided to release him. We'll emphasize that we take these matters seriously and that we're committed to justice and fairness. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it was the best they had. With any luck, it would be enough to calm the crowd and prevent the situation from escalating further. Thompson knew it wouldn't be easy, but she had no other choice. She had to think about the bigger picture, the department, her career, and the potential fallout if they didn't handle this properly. Thompson turned away from the window and headed back to the holding area. She was determined to resolve this before it got any worse. As she walked through the station, she passed by Riley and Jenkins, who were furiously typing up their reports. She paused for a moment, her gaze hardening. When this is over, we're going to have a long conversation about what went wrong here, she said coldly. And trust me, it won't be pretty. Riley swallowed hard, nodding silently. He knew he was in deep trouble, but there was nothing he could do now except hope that Thompson could fix the mess they had created. When Thompson reached Snoop's cell, she opened the door herself, stepping inside with measured calm. Mr. Dogg, I've reviewed the situation and it's clear that there was a misunderstanding. You're free to go. Snoop stood slowly, his expression guarded. A misunderstanding, Lieutenant? Is that what we're calling it? Thompson met his gaze, refusing to flinch. Yes, I'm deeply sorry for what happened here today. It shouldn't have gone this far. Snoop studied her for a moment, his sharp eyes searching for any sign of deceit. Finally, he nodded. I appreciate your apology, Lieutenant, but you should know this isn't over. Thompson didn't doubt it for a second. She knew Snoop wasn't the kind of man to let something like this slide, but for now, her priority was getting him out of the station safely and diffusing the situation outside. She escorted Snoop out of the holding area, past the tense officers who avoided his gaze. As they reached the front door, Thompson paused, taking a deep breath. I'll do everything I can to make this right, she said quietly. Snoop nodded but didn't reply. He stepped outside, and the crowd erupted into cheers at the sight of him. Cameras flashed, reporters shouted questions, but Snoop ignored them, walking calmly toward his waiting family and friends. As he embraced his loved ones, Thompson watched from the doorway, her expression unreadable. She knew this was only the beginning. Snoop would not let this go quietly, and the ripple effects of today's events would be felt for a long time. But for now, the immediate crisis was averted. The crowd was dispersing, the reporters were packing up, and the tension that had gripped the station was beginning to ease. Thompson knew she still had a long road ahead to fix the damage done, but she was determined to face it head-on. The atmosphere at the police station was heavy with tension as the day wore on. The events of the morning had set off a chain reaction that no one could have anticipated, and now everyone was waiting to see what would happen next. The news of Snoop Dogg's wrongful arrest had spread like wildfire, igniting outrage not just within the community, but across the entire city. Protests had erupted outside the station, with activists, community leaders, and concerned citizens demanding justice. Inside, Chief Frank Daniels was trying to salvage what was left of his reputation. He knew the department was on the brink of a public relations disaster, and the only way to prevent it from spiraling out of control was to make a public apology. But he also knew that a simple apology might not be enough to quell the anger that had been brewing for years. In his office, Chief Daniels sat at his desk, staring at the phone. His hands trembled slightly as he picked up the receiver, dialing the number for the public relations team. He needed to prepare a statement, something that would show the community that the department was taking this seriously. But deep down, he knew that no amount of carefully crafted words could undo the damage that had been done. When the PR team answered, Daniels spoke in a low, measured tone. I need you to draft a public apology. We're going to address the media outside the station this afternoon. Understood, Chief. We'll prepare something immediately, the voice on the other end replied. Daniels hung up the phone and leaned back in his chair, running a hand through his graying hair. He felt the weight of his decisions pressing down on him. the consequences of years of looking the other way, when officers like Riley and Jenkins crossed the line. He had always told himself that it was just part of the job, that sometimes you had to make compromises to keep the peace. But now those compromises were coming back to haunt him. A knock on the door pulled Daniels from his thoughts. Lieutenant Kate Thompson stood in the doorway, her expression tense but determined. "Chief," she said, "Snoop Dogg is waiting outside with the crowd." Daniels nodded, forcing himself to stand. "Good, I'm going out there to make the apology." Thompson hesitated, then stepped forward. "Chief, I need to tell you something before you go out there." Daniels raised an eyebrow. "What is it, Thompson?" She took a deep breath. "I've uncovered evidence of systemic corruption within the department. Bribery, cover-ups, racial profiling. This goes beyond just Riley and Jenkins. It's been happening for years, and it's been swept under the rug." Daniels felt a chill run down his spine. "Are you sure?" Thompson nodded. "I've already started gathering the evidence. With Snoop's help and the federal oversight team, we can start cleaning up this mess. But it's going to be a long and difficult process." Daniels exhaled slowly, his shoulders sagging under the weight of her words. "Then we do what we have to do. It's time to face the consequences of our actions." Thompson gave a small nod of approval. "I'll back you up out there, Chief. We need to show the community that we're serious about change." Daniels didn't reply, but the look in his eyes said everything. He knew this wasn't just about saving face anymore. This was about survival. If they didn't act now, the entire department could be dismantled. Together, they walked out of the office and headed toward the front of the station. As they approached the doors, they could hear the sound of the crowd outside, angry voices demanding justice, chanting for accountability. Daniels felt his stomach knot with anxiety, but he kept his expression neutral as he pushed open the doors and stepped out into the sunlight. The crowd fell silent as they saw him, cameras clicking, microphones thrust forward. Reporters called out questions, but Daniels ignored them, focusing on the podium that had been set up for the press conference. He could see Snoop standing among the crowd, his expression unreadable, his presence commanding attention. Daniels cleared his throat and stepped up to the microphone, adjusting it slightly. He could feel the eyes of the crowd on him, judging him, waiting to see what he would say. "Good afternoon," he began, his voice steady but strained. "I want to start by acknowledging the events that took place earlier today. The arrest of Mr. Snoop Dogg was a mistake, one that should never have happened. I take full responsibility for what occurred, and I want to offer my sincerest apologies to Mr. Dogg and to the community." The crowd murmured, a mixture of skepticism and anger rippling through the air. Daniels could feel the pressure building, the weight of decades of mistrust bearing down on him. "We recognize that this incident is part of a larger problem," Daniels continued, his tone somber. "A problem that has persisted for far too long within our department. I want to assure you all that we are committed to addressing these issues head-on. Effective immediately, Officers Riley and Jenkins have been suspended pending an internal investigation. We will be conducting a thorough review of our practices and procedures, and we will work closely with federal oversight to ensure that we are holding ourselves to the highest standards of accountability." The crowd was quiet now, listening intently, but Daniels could see the doubt in their eyes, the weariness that came from years of broken promises. "I know that words alone are not enough," Daniels said, his voice faltering slightly. "We have a lot of work to do to rebuild the trust that has been lost. But I want you to know that we are committed to making the necessary changes. We will work with community leaders, activists, and organizations to create a department that serves and protects everyone, regardless of race or background." He paused, searching for the right words to end his statement. But before he could continue, Snoop Dogg stepped forward, raising a hand to stop him. Snoop Dogg stepped forward, raising a hand to stop him. Chief Daniels hesitated, then stepped back from the microphone, giving Snoop the floor. The crowd, which had been murmuring in a mix of skepticism and anger, quieted as Snoop's commanding presence took over. Snoop adjusted his signature shades, pulling them off to reveal sharp, focused eyes that seemed to pierce through the tension in the air. He glanced around at the crowd, taking in their hopeful yet wary expressions, then turned his attention back to the microphone. "Chief Daniels," Snoop began, his deep, measured voice carrying across the crowd. "I appreciate the apology, but let's be real. This isn't just about words. This is about action. True justice isn't about saying the right thing when cameras are rolling. It's about doing the right thing when no one's watching." The crowd responded with murmurs of agreement, some nodding, others shouting their support. Snoop continued, his voice steady and resolute. "Let me make one thing clear. This isn't just about what happened to me today. This is about a system that's been broken for far too long. A system that treats people differently because of how they look, where they live, or what they've been through. A system that's supposed to protect us, but too often leaves us hurt, silenced, or worse." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle over the gathering. The silence was deafening, the crowd hanging on his every word. "I've been blessed," Snoop said, his tone softening. "Blessed to have a platform, blessed to have a voice that people listen to. But there are so many out here who don't have that. People who face this kind of injustice every day, and their stories don't make the news. They don't get the apologies, and that's why I'm here. Not just for me, but for them." The crowd erupted in applause, their cheers filling the air. Snoop held up a hand, signaling for quiet, and they quickly obliged. "Chief Daniels, I hear you saying you're committed to change, and I want to believe that. I want to believe that we can work together to make this city a better place. But let me tell you something. Change isn't just about suspending a couple of officers. It's about digging deep and fixing what's broken at the core." He turned to the crowd now, his voice rising with conviction. "It's about accountability. It's about transparency. And it's about making sure that the next generation doesn't have to live with the same fear, the same frustration, and the same pain that so many of us have had to deal with." The crowd cheered again, louder this time, their voices a wave of support and solidarity. Snoop paused, letting the energy of the moment wash over him. "Change doesn't happen overnight," Snoop continued, his voice steady but tinged with urgency. "It takes time, it takes effort, and it takes all of us working together, on the streets, in these offices, in our schools, and in our homes. But here's what I know. Change can happen. I've seen it. I've lived it. And I believe we can make it happen again." The crowd erupted into another wave of applause, their cheers echoing off the buildings around them. Snoop stepped back from the microphone, his message delivered. The crowd's response was overwhelming. A surge of hope and determination filled the air. As the applause swelled, Chief Daniels hesitated for a moment before stepping back up to the microphone. He adjusted it slightly, cleared his throat, and addressed the crowd. "Mr. Dogg is absolutely right," Daniels said, his voice subdued but resolute. "Real change will only come through action, through accountability, transparency, and collaboration. And as Chief of Police, I am committed to ensuring that our department rises to meet this challenge." The crowd listened intently, their cheers quieter now but no less supportive. Daniels continued, "We will begin by partnering with community leaders, activists, and organizations to create real reforms. Together, we'll build a system that truly serves everyone." The crowd's approval was evident, but Snoop knew this was only the beginning. He watched as Daniels stepped back, the chief's face a mixture of determination and unease. The work ahead would be hard and full of resistance, but the momentum in the crowd gave Snoop hope. As the crowd began to disperse, Snoop stepped down from the stage and walked toward the people gathered below. Supporters surrounded him, reaching out for handshakes and words of encouragement. Snoop embraced their gratitude, but stayed focused. He knew the road ahead would be long. Later that evening, Lieutenant Thompson stood on the steps of the station, watching as the last of the crowd began to thin. The tension of the day had given way to a quiet, simmering resolve. Thompson turned to Chief Daniels, who remained by her side. "We have a lot of work to do," Thompson said, her voice quiet but firm. Daniels nodded, his gaze fixed on the horizon where the sun was beginning to set. "Yes, we do. But if today showed me anything, it's that this community is ready for it. Now we have to prove that we are too." Thompson nodded, her mind racing with the challenges ahead. She knew the department was standing at a crossroads, They could either face the hard truths and commit to real change, or they could crumble under the weight of their mistakes. Across the city, Snoop found himself reflecting on the day's events. As he sat in a quiet room at the Community Justice Initiative, surrounded by plans, reports, and proposals, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. The fight was far from over, but for the first time in a long time, he felt like the tide was turning. The city had been shaken to its core, but the resilience of its people, their willingness to come together and demand better, gave him hope. It was a fragile hope, but it was enough. The road ahead was filled with uncertainty, but Snoop knew one thing for sure. As long as he had a voice, he would use it to fight for justice, for equality, and for the dignity of every person in his community. Across the city, in a small community center tucked between rows of aging apartment buildings, another critical meeting was underway. Snoop sat at the head of a large table, surrounded by an eclectic group of community leaders, activists, educators, and legal experts. The room hummed with energy as voices rose and fell in animated discussion. "This can't just be about what happens at the police station," Maria Hernandez, a passionate school teacher, said. "If we're serious about change, we need to start with the next generation. Education has to be part of the solution." Dr. James Carter, a sociology professor with years of experience in community activism, nodded in agreement. "You're absolutely right, Maria. But we also can't ignore the immediate issues, like wrongful arrests and profiling. People need help now, and we need to act on both fronts." Snoop listened intently, leaning forward with his hands clasped together. He appreciated the passion in the room. This was the type of collaboration he had hoped to foster, one where every voice mattered and solutions came from the ground up. "You're both right," Snoop finally said, his calm voice cutting through the clamor. "We need to handle what's happening today while making sure we're building something better for tomorrow. Let's focus on the practical steps we can take right now. Legal aid, community oversight, and education. All of it." Heads nodded around the table as the group began to hammer out concrete plans. They would establish a free legal aid clinic to help those who couldn't afford representation. They would form a community oversight board to work alongside the police department, ensuring transparency and accountability. And they would launch educational programs in schools and community centers, teaching civil rights, conflict resolution, and civic engagement. As the meeting wore on, ideas became action items. Timelines were set, responsibilities assigned. The energy in the room was electric, and by the time they adjourned, there was a palpable sense of progress. Weeks turned into months, and the impact of their work began to ripple through the city. The legal aid clinic took on its first cases, representing individuals who had been wrongfully arrested or subjected to police misconduct. The Community Oversight Board began reviewing complaints and pushing for reforms within the department. At the same time, the educational programs gained traction. Schools and community centers piloted new curricula designed to empower students with knowledge of their rights and responsibilities. Teachers like Maria saw the difference in their classrooms. Students were asking questions, engaging in discussions, and becoming more aware of the power they held as members of the community. But the most profound change was in the atmosphere of the city itself. For the first time in years, there was a sense of hope. Neighborhood watch groups started working with police officers to improve safety without resorting to profiling. Community forums were held regularly, providing spaces for open dialogue between citizens and local officials. Of course, there were still challenges. Incidents of misconduct still occurred, and moments of mistrust lingered. Change was slow and often met with resistance. But the difference now was that there were systems in place to address these issues. Accountability wasn't just a promise, it was a process. 6 months after his arrest, Snoop found himself walking back into the police station. Not as a suspect or a victim, but as a partner. He had been invited to speak to a group of new recruits, part of a revamped training program aimed at fostering better community relations. As he walked through the station, he noted the changes. The once tense atmosphere felt different. Officers greeted him with respect. Some even stopped to shake his hand. Lieutenant Thompson met him at the door to the training room, her demeanor warm but professional. "Thank you for doing this, Mr. Dogg," she said, extending her hand. Snoop shook it firmly. "It's my pleasure, Lieutenant. And please call me Snoop." Inside the training room, rows of young recruits sat waiting. Some looked curious, others hesitant, but all were attentive. Snoop stepped to the front of the room, his presence commanding as always. "Good morning," he began, his deep voice filling the space. "My name is Snoop Dogg, and I'm here to talk to you all about justice. Not just the kind you'll be enforcing, but the kind that goes beyond the badge. The kind that's about treating every person you meet with dignity and respect." As he spoke, Snoop shared his own experiences, weaving in the lessons he had learned and the perspectives he had gained. The recruits listened intently, their questions thoughtful, their engagement genuine. By the end of the session, the room felt transformed. One young recruit approached him afterward, her face earnest. "Mr. Dogg," she said hesitantly, "thank you for coming today. Listening to you reminded me why I joined in the first place. To make a difference. I won't forget that." Snoop smiled, his faith in the next generation bolstered. "What's your name?" he asked. "Sarah," she replied. "Sarah Johnson." "Well, Sarah, we need more people like you," Snoop said. "People who care, who listen, and who aren't afraid to stand up for what's right." Later that evening, Snoop sat in his office at the Community Justice Initiative. The room was modest but functional, with stacks of case files, legal books, and notes covering the desk. The soft glow of a desk lamp illuminated his focused expression as he reviewed reports and plans. The work was endless, but it was also deeply fulfilling. Each small victory, each life improved, was a reminder of why this mattered. A knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. Looking up, he saw Maria Hernandez standing in the doorway, her face alight with excitement. "Snoop," she said, practically bouncing on her feet. "I just got out of a meeting with the school board. They've approved the curriculum for all high schools in the district." Snoop broke into a broad smile and stood, reaching out to shake her hand. "Maria, that's incredible news. Your hard work is paying off." Maria beamed, but her expression soon turned serious. "It's not just me, Snoop. This is all of us. What happened to you? It lit a fire under this community. People want change, and they're willing to fight for it." Snoop nodded, humbled. "You're right. This is bigger than any one person. It's about everyone coming together to make it happen." They spent the next hour discussing the rollout of the new curriculum and the plans to expand their educational programs. For Snoop, this was what real change looked like. Not just words, but actions that would shape the future. Later that night, as Snoop finally headed home, he paused outside the office. The street was quiet, the city settling into its nighttime rhythm. He tilted his head back to look at the stars, their light twinkling against the dark sky. So much had changed in the past 6 months. The journey had been painful and full of challenges, but it had also sparked something powerful: hope. The road ahead was still long, with new battles to fight and obstacles to overcome. But Snoop felt a sense of peace and determination. They were on the right path, and they wouldn't stop until the work was done. The changes in the city continued to grow. Neighborhood forums became regular events, giving citizens and officials a platform to discuss issues and work together. The police department, under the watchful eye of Lieutenant Thompson and the Community Oversight Board, began implementing meaningful reforms. Officers like Sarah Johnson, who had joined the force with a genuine desire to make a difference, became part of a new wave of law enforcement committed to fairness and respect. The Community Justice Initiative thrived, taking on more cases and expanding its reach. Their educational programs spread to middle schools, ensuring that the next generation grew up understanding their rights and responsibilities. 6 months turned into a year, and the city began to feel the ripple effects of the movement Snoop had helped ignite. At the police station, officers engaged in open dialogues with community members. The tension that had once defined their interactions gave way to mutual respect and collaboration. At the community center, Snoop hosted a celebration to mark the 1-year anniversary of the initiative. The event was a vibrant affair, filled with music, laughter, and speeches from those who had been touched by the work they were doing. As Snoop took the stage, the crowd erupted in applause. He raised his hands, gesturing for quiet. "Y'all, tonight isn't about me," he began, his voice steady and warm. "It's about us. It's about what happens when people come together to demand something better, to build something better. Every single one of you here is part of this, and together we're proving that change isn't just possible, it's inevitable." The crowd cheered, the energy in the room electric. Snoop smiled, feeling the weight of their collective determination. Later that night, as he walked home under the stars, Snoop reflected on the journey that had brought them here. He thought about the arrest that had sparked it all, the anger and pain that had fueled their fight, and the resilience that had carried them through. He knew the fight wasn't over. There would always be new challenges, new struggles, but he also knew they had built something strong, something that would endure. With renewed determination, Snoop turned the corner toward his house, ready to face whatever came next. The work would continue, and so would the hope.